What would you do if your entire life was suddenly turned upside down and the people you trusted the most turned against you? The question had been haunting Sophie ever since that fateful phone call. She couldn't help but replay the words in her mind as she sat on the edge of her bed, her phone resting on the wooden nightstand beside her. It was late, much later than she normally stayed up, but she couldn't sleep. Her heart raced with every beat, her mind swirling with thoughts she couldn't quite make sense of. Just an hour ago, she'd received the most unexpected, most soul-shattering call of her life. Her mom, the woman who had always been there for her, comforting her during tough times, offering advice, loving her unconditionally, had said things that Sophie couldn't even process. Things that felt like betrayal. Sophie stared at her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, debating whether to call her back. But what was there to say? Could she even make sense of what had just happened? Could she undo the words that had been spoken? Taking a deep breath, she picked up the phone and scrolled through her recent contacts until her mom's name appeared on the screen. She hesitated, then pressed the call button. It rang once, then twice. By the third ring, Sophie was already regretting it. "Hello, sweetheart." Her mother's voice was calm, almost too calm, considering the way the conversation had ended. "Mom, what was that about?" Sophie's voice trembled despite her best effort to sound strong. Her mom didn't seem surprised by the question. In fact, her tone seemed oddly detached. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, Sophie." Sophie felt her stomach twist. "No, I don't." "How could you say that? I didn't ruin her life. I didn't do anything wrong." "You didn't, Sophie?" Her mom's voice grew sharper now. "You really think that, after everything Olivia's been through, you didn't play a part in it? You didn't ruin everything for her?" Olivia. The name hit Sophie like a ton of bricks. She hadn't expected her mom to side with Olivia, but she also hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. "What are you talking about, Mom? Olivia's been my best friend for years. I'd never do anything to hurt her. You don't get it, do you?" Her mom sighed, a sigh that cut through the air like a blade. "You've destroyed everything for her. And for us. I can't believe you'd choose her over your family." Sophie felt her eyes welling up with tears. She clenched her jaw to hold them back. "I didn't choose her over you. I'm trying to figure things out. I didn't expect this." "Neither did we. But you need to face the truth. Your father agrees with me. I'm not the only one saying this." Sophie's heart dropped to her stomach. Her dad? How could he be on her side, too? She had always felt close to her father, and the thought that he would turn against her, it felt like a knife in her chest. I don't understand. You're all accusing me of something I didn't even do." Her voice cracked, the frustration building with each passing second. "You've always been so selfish, Sophie. Always doing what you want without thinking about the consequences. And now, look where we are. Olivia's life is ruined, and we've all been dragged into this mess. I don't know if I can keep supporting you if this is the path you've chosen." The words hit Sophie like a slap in the face. Her mother, her rock, her confidant, was saying that she couldn't support her anymore. She felt her chest tighten with the weight of everything crashing down at once. You don't mean that, do you?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mom paused for a moment, and Sophie could almost hear her taking a deep breath. "I don't know anymore, Sophie. I just don't know." And with that, the line went dead. Sophie stared at the phone, her hands shaking. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, streaming down her face in a torrent she couldn't stop. She had never felt more alone in her life. Her mind raced. She didn't know what had happened between her and Olivia. Everything had been fine just days ago. They were inseparable, the kind of best friends who could talk about anything. But now Olivia was accusing her of destroying her life. What was that about? The truth was, Sophie didn't know the whole story. All she knew was that Olivia had been distant lately, and when Sophie tried to confront her, Olivia had pushed her away. There had been a falling out, a huge one, but Sophie had never imagined it would come to this. She had always believed their bond was unbreakable. So, what had gone wrong? But it wasn't just Olivia. Her parents, her own flesh and blood, had sided with her. Her mother had called her selfish, her father had agreed, and now Sophie was being painted as the villain in a story she hadn't even been given the chance to understand. The thought stung hard. She needed answers. She needed to find out what had happened, what Olivia was accusing her of, and why her family had turned their backs on her. But there was only one way to get that answer. She had to leave. She had to get away from the people who had always been her support system, the people who had just torn her apart. They didn't want her anymore. They wanted her to fix something that wasn't hers to fix. Sophie stood up from her bed and walked over to her window, gazing out at the city skyline that had always been a source of comfort. Now it felt like a foreign land. She didn't belong here anymore. Not in this house, not in this family. With a heavy heart and a mind full of confusion, she made up her mind. She couldn't stay. She couldn't fix something she didn't even understand. Sophie grabbed her bag, packed a few things enough to get by for a few days, and made her way to the door. Before she stepped outside, she took one last look around. This house, this family, was no longer her home. With a final, resolute breath, Sophie stepped out into the night, leaving everything she knew behind. And though the pain of the moment was unbearable, she knew this was the only choice she had left. Her new life had just begun, and it was all unknown. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sophie had always thought she understood her place in the world. Growing up, she had a stable home, 2 loving parents, and a best friend who was like a sister to her. Life had felt almost too easy at times, but that was before the cracks began to show. Before she ever questioned if everything she thought was real actually was. Her earliest memories of her family were of laughter, comfort, and warmth. Her mom, always there with a gentle hand to guide her, and her dad, with his quiet, steady strength, had shaped the woman she was becoming. Sophie never questioned their love, never questioned their support. It was always there, solid and unwavering. But as Sophie grew older, things began to change. It was subtle at first, small disagreements, little moments where her parents' expectations clashed with her desires. She was their only child, their pride and joy, and they had high hopes for her. They wanted her to be perfect, to excel in school, to follow a straight path toward success. And Sophie tried, she really did. She loved them, and she wanted to make them proud. But as she navigated adolescence, she realized she wasn't quite the person they thought she was supposed to be. It wasn't just about grades or achievements. It was about who she was on the inside, her passions, her desires, her dreams. They were slowly suffocating under the weight of her parents' ambitions for her. One of the few places Sophie found freedom was with Olivia. Olivia was the epitome of everything Sophie wasn't, and in a strange way, that was what made them so close. Where Sophie was reserved, Olivia was outspoken and bold. Where Sophie followed the rules, Olivia had a tendency to bend, break, or downright ignore them. Olivia was the kind of person who made life feel more like an adventure than a set of rigid expectations. She pushed Sophie to take risks, to step outside of her comfort zone, and to challenge the status quo. The two had met in middle school when Sophie had been awkward, shy, and a little too concerned about what others thought. Olivia, on the other hand, had walked into the classroom on the first day of 7th grade, like she owned the place. She immediately saw something in Sophie, a kindred spirit, someone who needed a little push to realize her full potential. Their friendship grew quickly. It wasn't just the typical teenage bond, it was deeper, more complex. They confided in each other, shared dreams and fears, and for Sophie, Olivia became the one person she felt she could truly be herself around. But over time, Sophie had noticed a shift in Olivia. A subtle change that made her start to question everything they had built together. Olivia was always pushing boundaries, pushing people away and pulling them back in, creating chaos and drama wherever she went. And Sophie, being the quiet one, the peacekeeper, had always been there to pick up the pieces. There were moments Sophie still couldn't fully understand, where Olivia seemed to pull away. Little things at first, like not answering calls, canceling plans, or acting distant when Sophie needed her the most. But Sophie never thought much of it. After all, it was Olivia. She was a hurricane of emotions, always pulling people in and then pushing them away again. But this time, something felt different. Olivia had been acting colder, more distant, and Sophie had noticed her pulling away, not just from her, but from everyone. And then the incident happened. The one that Sophie still didn't quite understand. Olivia had accused her of something Sophie never imagined would come up between them. She said Sophie had ruined her life. Sophie didn't know what that even meant. She had tried to reach out, tried to fix whatever had gone wrong, but Olivia was having none of it. That was the first time Sophie had truly felt lost. Her parents, always so supportive of Olivia in the past, had taken her side. When Sophie had tried to explain, they just didn't get it. They didn't understand why she hadn't fixed things with Olivia sooner, or why she seemed so torn about the situation. They believed Olivia, believed that Sophie had somehow destroyed the most important relationship in her life. Family first, her mom had told her, time and time again, when Sophie tried to make sense of what was happening. Sometimes, you have to cut ties with people who bring chaos into your life. You need to stop enabling her behavior. But Sophie didn't want to believe that about Olivia. She couldn't. Not after everything they had been through. They were best friends. She couldn't just turn her back on her. And yet, her family had. Sophie wasn't sure if it was the pressure of the situation or the weight of her parents' disappointment that finally made her snap, but one night, she had walked out. She had packed her things, made a few calls, and left. The choice had felt liberating at first. Sophie had always been the good daughter, the one who followed the rules, the one who tried to be everything her parents wanted her to be. But the moment she walked out that door, everything changed. For the first time in her life, Sophie was truly alone. It wasn't like she hadn't known that the relationship with her family was strained. Sophie had always known that her parents expected more from her than she could give. But this was different. This was her family telling her, in no uncertain terms, that they didn't want her anymore. They believed she had ruined everything. Her mom's words still echoed in her mind. You've destroyed everything for her. And for us. Sophie didn't know if she could ever come back from that. She didn't know if she wanted to. She didn't have anywhere specific to go, but Sophie knew she needed space. She couldn't stay in the house where she'd grown up. Not after everything that had happened. So, she packed a bag, left behind the life she knew, and went to stay with a friend for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. It felt like a fresh start, but deep down, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was running away from the problem instead of facing it. She knew that eventually, she would have to confront what had happened with Olivia and with her family. But for now, Sophie just needed to breathe. The days after Sophie left her family's house were a blur of confusion and isolation. She stayed at a friend's apartment for a while, trying to find a sense of stability, but nothing seemed to fit. There was an undeniable emptiness that followed her everywhere, a feeling of being untethered in a world she no longer understood. She tried to keep busy. Sophie would go to the coffee shop in the mornings, grab a cup of coffee, and read. She'd take walks around the city, trying to lose herself in the busy streets, hoping that the noise would drown out the constant thoughts in her mind. But no matter how far she walked, or how many books she read, she couldn't escape the feeling that everything, was falling apart. And then, of course, there was Olivia. The moment Sophie stepped away from the chaos of her family, she thought she might find some clarity with Olivia. She figured that once the dust settled, they'd both be able to talk, maybe even heal the rift between them. After all, they had been through so much together. How could one argument destroy everything? But every time Sophie reached out, she was met with silence. Olivia wouldn't answer her calls, wouldn't reply to her texts. Sophie had tried everything. She'd sent her a message that simply read, "Can we talk?" And nothing. No response. Nothing at all. It was as if Olivia had erased her from her life completely, and it stung. Sophie couldn't help but wonder what she had done so wrong to make Olivia shut her out like this. Had it been the argument? Had she really said or done something to make her friend feel like Sophie had ruined her life? But what hurt most of all was the way Olivia's silence was reflected in her family's behavior. Sophie's parents, especially her mom, hadn't spoken to her since she walked out. They hadn't called, hadn't checked in. They didn't seem to care about what she was going through. They had made it clear they were disappointed, and they expected her to fix things. But how could she fix something she didn't understand? The first few days after leaving felt like a release, a moment of freedom from expectations. But now, that freedom was suffocating. Sophie didn't know who she was anymore without her family and without Olivia. She felt like she was losing pieces of herself, and each day it seemed like the pieces were slipping further away. It was on a rainy Tuesday afternoon that the storm within Sophie finally reached its peak. She had spent the morning at the coffee shop, hoping the steady clink of cups and chatter of other customers would offer some comfort. Instead, it only made her more restless. After sitting there for an hour without touching her coffee, she stood up, grabbed her things, and left. Her phone buzzed in her pocket just as she stepped outside into the cold drizzle. It was an email from her mom. Subject: Sophie, we need to talk. She paused for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest as she opened the email. I'm still waiting for you to come to your senses. You need to fix things with Olivia. You've made your choice, and I can't support you in this decision any longer. We're not asking for a miracle, just an apology and some understanding. Please come home. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Her mom was giving her an ultimatum. It was as if Sophie had no choice but to fall in line with their expectations, to do whatever it took to repair the damage, whether she understood it or not. The worst part was that she didn't know if she could even apologize. She didn't feel like she had done anything wrong, yet everyone around her seemed to think she was the villain in the story. What hurt the most, though, was that her mom's words felt so cold, so distant. There was no trace of the warmth Sophie had once known, the kind that made her feel like she was understood, loved. Now, everything was just about fixing something that didn't feel broken to Sophie. She wasn't sure how to fix it, and worse, she didn't know if she even wanted to. Tears welled up in her eyes, but Sophie wiped them away angrily. She couldn't let herself break down. Not now. She turned off her phone and shoved it into her bag, not caring about the messages, the emails, or the calls that might flood in. She needed to get away from it all. She needed space, time to breathe, time to think. Sophie wandered through the streets aimlessly, her thoughts tangled in a mess of frustration and hurt. Her feet led her to the edge of the city, where the concrete gave way to the quiet of the park. It was a peaceful area, with tall trees that seemed to stretch into the sky, their leaves gently swaying in the wind. It was the kind of place where she used to come when she needed clarity, when she wanted to escape the chaos of her mind. But today, even the serenity of the park felt out of reach. Sophie found a bench beneath a large oak tree and sat down, drawing her knees up to her chest. She wrapped her arms around her legs and buried her face in her knees. She was so tired, physically, emotionally, spiritually tired. Why had everything gone so wrong? Why had the people who were supposed to love her unconditionally turned their backs on her? She had tried to be the good daughter, the loyal friend. But no one seemed to see that. All they saw was her mistakes, her choices, and the consequences she could no longer escape. After a few moments, Sophie stood up, wiping her eyes one last time. There was a burning desire deep inside of her, something that urged her to fight. She didn't know what for, exactly, but she knew she couldn't let herself be swallowed by the situation. She couldn't just let it end like this. She needed to understand. She needed answers. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain: Sophie was done being passive. She would find the truth. She would find Olivia. And somehow, someway, she would fix this mess. And if no one else was going to support her, then she would have to do it herself. The next few days felt like an eternity. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of her control. The tension in her chest was constant, like an uninvited guest she couldn't get rid of. Each time she picked up her phone, a part of her hoped that there would be a message from Olivia or from her parents, maybe even a sign that things could go back to the way they used to be. But nothing came. Silence. And it was unbearable. Olivia had been her closest friend for years, someone Sophie had never imagined could just disappear. Yet that was exactly what had happened. The sudden and complete absence of Olivia felt like a wound Sophie couldn't bandage. She thought about all the memories they had shared, the secrets they'd whispered in the dark of the night, and the promises made between them. It was hard to believe that Olivia, her best friend, her sister, could just walk away, leaving Sophie to pick up the pieces of a life they had both built together. So, Sophie made a decision. She had to find Olivia. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a necessity. The pain of living without answers, without closure, was unbearable. She needed to hear Olivia's side of the story. She needed to know what had gone wrong. Sophie couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. She knew it wouldn't be easy, nothing about the situation had been, but she had to try. She had to fix it, or at least try to. Sophie packed a bag and left her friend's apartment early one morning. She didn't know exactly where Olivia was, but she had a few clues. Olivia had always been unpredictable, and Sophie had no idea where she might have gone after everything fell apart. But she knew one thing: Olivia couldn't have disappeared entirely. There was always a way to reach her. She started with the places Olivia had loved, places that had been special to them both. They had spent countless afternoons at the park by the lake, talking about their future, their dreams. Sophie figured it was a good place to start. She hoped that maybe, just maybe, she'd find Olivia there, sitting on one of the benches, waiting for Sophie to come to her. It wasn't the most logical of plans, but Sophie was desperate. She arrived at the park an hour later, the crisp autumn air biting at her skin. The park was nearly empty, the trees bare, their leaves scattered across the ground like fragments of forgotten moments. Sophie walked slowly through the park, scanning each bench and path, but there was no sign of Olivia. Her heart sank, but she wasn't ready to give up. She continued walking, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She had to find her. She couldn't go back to a life without answers. Not now. Not after everything they had shared. Sophie's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a familiar voice. "Sophie?" She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She turned around, and there, standing at the edge of the park, was Olivia. Her appearance was different. Her hair, once bright and vibrant, was now dull and unkempt. Her clothes were worn, as though she hadn't been taking care of herself. But it was Olivia. It had to be. "Sophie." Olivia's voice trembled as she stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes red and tired. "What are you doing here?" Sophie's breath caught in her chest. She hadn't prepared for this moment. She had imagined this conversation in her head so many times, but now that it was finally happening, she felt like she was losing her voice. I needed to see you," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what happened, Olivia. I don't know what I did to make you hate me, but I need to understand." Olivia's eyes hardened for a moment, and Sophie felt a chill in the air between them. The space that had once been filled with laughter, comfort, and shared memories now felt distant, cold. Olivia looked away, shaking her head. You don't get it, do you? Olivia's words cut through the silence, sharp and painful. You always thought you had everything figured out, Sophie. You always thought you knew what was best for me, what was best for both of us. But you didn't. You ruined everything. Sophie flinched at the words. It wasn't the first time Olivia had said something like that, but it still hit her hard. She had never seen herself as the villain in their friendship. She had always tried to be there for Olivia, tried to support her even when it seemed like Olivia didn't want to be helped. I never wanted to ruin anything, Sophie said, her voice breaking. I just wanted to be there for you. You're my best friend. I didn't mean to hurt you. Olivia looked away again, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of her emotions was too much to bear. Sophie could see the pain in her eyes, the same pain she felt, the same anger, the same confusion. You can't fix this, Sophie, Olivia said softly, her voice full of regret. You can't go back. You can't erase what happened. Sophie's heart shattered in that moment. She didn't know how to fix things. She didn't know how to undo the damage. But she couldn't accept that their friendship was over. Please, Olivia, Sophie pleaded. I don't know what happened between us, but I don't want to lose you. We've been through so much together. Please, just talk to me. Please let me help you. Olivia looked at Sophie for a long moment, her eyes filled with uncertainty. For the first time since Sophie had found her, Olivia seemed vulnerable. She was no longer the confident, untouchable person Sophie had always known. She was broken, just like Sophie was. I don't know if I can do that, Olivia whispered. I don't know if I can forgive you. Sophie's heart ached at the words. But something in Olivia's tone, the way she was still standing there, was enough to give Sophie a flicker of hope. I'll wait for you, Sophie said, her voice steady despite the tears she felt threatening to fall. I don't care how long it takes. I'll be here. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for whatever I did. I never meant to hurt you. Olivia stood there in silence for a long time, her face unreadable. Sophie felt every second of it, every moment of doubt and confusion that hung in the air between them. But finally, Olivia spoke. I don't know, Sophie, but I'll think about it. I'll think about what you said. Sophie nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't a resolution, but it was a step, maybe the first real step toward healing. Thank you, Sophie whispered, her heart still heavy but lighter than it had been in weeks. As she turned to leave, Sophie felt like she was walking towards something new, something uncertain but possible. She didn't know if Olivia would forgive her. She didn't know if they could ever go back to the way things were. But she knew one thing for sure. This was the beginning of something. Maybe not an end, but a beginning. And that, at least, was worth fighting for. The days that followed the meeting with Olivia were a blur of uncertainty and raw emotion. Sophie had no idea what to do with herself. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope, however faint it was, that maybe things could be mended. But that hope was tempered by the crushing weight of the silence that followed. Olivia hadn't called. She hadn't texted. And despite Sophie's desperate attempt to convince herself that this time would be different, the silence was louder than ever. Sophie threw herself into her work, trying to bury the ache in her chest, but it didn't help. Every email, every meeting felt like a distraction from the overwhelming reality that Olivia was still hurting. And Sophie wasn't sure how to make it better. Every attempt to reach out had only pushed Olivia further away. Every apology seemed to fall flat. Then, one afternoon, Sophie received a message. It was short, direct, and to the point. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending like nothing happened. You've hurt me more than I can say, Sophie, and I don't think I can ever forgive you for it. The words hit Sophie like a punch to the gut. She read the message over and over, each time hoping it would change, hoping that she was misunderstanding something. But no matter how many times she read it, the words stayed the same. She had ruined everything. The finality in Olivia's message was suffocating. It wasn't the angry words Sophie had expected. It was the quiet resignation that tore her apart. Olivia had given up. Sophie had no idea what she had done wrong, but this was the end. There was no coming back from this. Sophie's phone slipped from her hands and fell onto the couch beside her. She sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, as if willing Olivia to text again. To say it was a mistake. To say that they could work things out. But that didn't happen. Instead, Sophie's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email. And it was from her mother. "Sophie, your father and I are worried about you. We haven't heard from you in days. You need to make things right. Come home. Your family needs you." The words twisted in Sophie's chest like a knife. It wasn't the first time her parents had made their disapproval known, but this time felt different. They had always been disappointed in her. Always expected more from her, but now it felt like their disappointment was final. There was no understanding left. No empathy. Just a demand. Sophie's fingers trembled as she typed a response, but she couldn't find the words. She wanted to say something, anything, to explain that she wasn't the one who needed to change. She wanted to scream that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she had tried, that she had given everything to this family and to Olivia. But all she could do was sit there, paralyzed by the weight of everything that had happened. Instead, Sophie simply typed, "I can't." Not yet. She pressed send before she could second-guess herself, and as soon as the words left her, a cold emptiness settled over her. She stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, unable to escape the suffocating feeling that everything in her life was slipping through her fingers. But then came the knock at the door. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she stood up, her legs unsteady. Who could be at her door? She hadn't told anyone where she was staying, and she hadn't made any plans to meet with anyone. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in front of her, was her father. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time in years. He looked older, his face worn, but his eyes held a sadness that Sophie had never seen before. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in days. "I shouldn't have let it get this far." Sophie blinked, unsure if she was hearing him correctly. "What?" Her father stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't sit down. Instead, he just stood there, his eyes fixed on her as though searching for something. "I should have been there for you," he continued. "I should have seen how much pain you were in, how much you were struggling. But I wasn't. And I'm sorry for that." Sophie felt like the ground beneath her feet was shaking. She couldn't understand what was happening. Her father had always been distant, always busy with work, but this wasn't what she had expected. She had prepared herself for more disappointment, more rejection, but not this. I don't understand," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. "What do you mean? What's happening?" "I'm saying that your mother and we've been hard on you. We've been so focused on what we thought was best for you that we didn't see how much we were pushing you away. I see that now, and I can't let you go through this alone." Sophie shook her head, her emotions raw. "But it's too late, Dad. It's too late for me to just go back like nothing happened. Olivia, she won't even talk to me. And you don't even understand what I've been through." Her father's eyes softened. I know I don't understand, Sophie. But we're your family. And we should have been there for you when you needed us the most. I should have been there for you, and I wasn't. I'm sorry for that." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain. Sophie didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive him. She didn't know if she could forgive him. But the apology, the vulnerability in his voice, was something she hadn't expected. It was something she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. "I don't know if I can come back," Sophie said quietly. I don't know if I can do this again. Her father nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper, which he handed to Sophie. Just think about it, he said softly. This is a letter from Olivia. She asked me to give it to you. Sophie froze, the letter trembling in her hands. Her heart raced. Olivia had sent it. After everything that had happened, Olivia had reached out, through her father of all people. Sophie slowly opened the letter, her hands shaking. Her eyes scanned the words written in Olivia's unmistakable handwriting. I don't know if we can ever go back to the way we were, but I don't want to lose you. I need time, but I'm not giving up on us. Please don't give up on me. The words burned into Sophie's mind. There was hope. There was a chance. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end after all. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Sophie sat there for what felt like hours, the letter still clutched in her hands. Her father had left quietly, giving her space to process everything that had just happened. But Sophie couldn't stop reading Olivia's words over and over again, as if willing them to make more sense with each new reading. I'm not giving up on us. The words echoed in her mind, a lifeline thrown into the swirling sea of doubt that had consumed her for weeks. Sophie hadn't realized how desperately she had been waiting for that, waiting for Olivia to offer her a sliver of hope, some indication that everything wasn't lost, that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for reconciliation. She wiped away the tears that had started to fall, unable to suppress the flood of emotions that overwhelmed her. The anger, the hurt, the confusion, all of it had built up for so long that the simple act of reading Olivia's letter, of hearing that she wasn't giving up on their friendship, felt like a balm to a wound she hadn't even realized was still raw. Sophie stood up, pacing around the small apartment. Her thoughts were racing, a whirlwind of uncertainty and possibilities. What did this mean for her? What did it mean for Olivia? Could they really move past everything that had happened? Was it even possible to rebuild what had been broken? And then, as if the universe had decided to give her another nudge, her phone buzzed again. Sophie's heart leaped in her chest, her hands trembling as she picked it up. This time, the message was from Olivia. I don't want to do this over text. Can we meet? Please. I need to see you. Sophie didn't think twice. She responded immediately. Yes. Where and when? Within minutes, Olivia sent the address of a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a place they had visited together many times in the past. The memories of their long, laughter-filled afternoons spent there flooded Sophie's mind. It felt surreal to be in this moment, knowing that this could be the moment when everything would either fall apart or begin to heal. She stood up quickly, grabbing her jacket and bag. The air outside was chilly, but it didn't matter. She needed to go. She needed to see Olivia face to face, to hear her voice, and finally get the answers to the questions that had been tormenting her for so long. The cafe was nearly empty when Sophie arrived, the soft hum of quiet conversation and the clink of coffee cups filling the air. She spotted Olivia immediately, sitting at a small table near the window, her back to Sophie. She looked different somehow, distant, guarded, but there was a vulnerability in her posture that Sophie had never seen before. Olivia glanced up as Sophie approached, her eyes searching Sophie's face for any sign of what was to come. Sophie smiled softly, though it was shaky, uncertain. Hey, Sophie said quietly, sitting down across from Olivia. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to find the right words to break the silence. Olivia didn't say anything at first. She just looked at Sophie, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions, hurt, longing, confusion. It was as if she was weighing whether or not to let Sophie into her world again. Olivia began, then stopped herself, as if the words weren't quite ready to come out. She looked away briefly, taking a shaky breath before meeting Sophie's gaze again. I've been so angry at you, Sophie. So angry and hurt, I didn't know what to do with myself. I thought I could just walk away and forget it. But I can't. I can't forget you. I can't forget us. Sophie's heart squeezed painfully in her chest. She had known, deep down, that Olivia was hurting just as much as she was. She had known that the anger and distance between them were just layers of pain they both had been too scared to face. I know I hurt you, Sophie said, her voice trembling. I don't know how or why things got so messed up, but I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant to hurt you, Olivia. Never. You were my best friend. You are still my best friend. Olivia's eyes filled with tears as she reached out, hesitantly touching Sophie's hand. The gesture was small, fragile, but it was enough to break through the walls Sophie had been building around her own heart. I know, Olivia whispered. I know. But it's not just about what you did, Sophie. It's about me too. I've been carrying around so much anger, so much resentment. I didn't know how to let it go. I didn't know how to tell you how much I was hurting. The words hit Sophie like a wave, overwhelming her. She had been so focused on her own pain, so fixated on the idea that Olivia was the one who had pushed her away, that she hadn't stopped to think about how much Olivia had been carrying. It was clear now that they both had been broken in different ways, and it had been easier to hide behind anger than to face the raw, vulnerable truth. I've been angry too, Sophie admitted, her voice thick with emotion. I've been angry that you wouldn't talk to me, angry that I didn't know what I did wrong, angry that you just left without any explanation. But the truth is, I was scared. Scared that I would lose you. And maybe, in the process, I pushed you away, too. I don't know. Olivia took a deep breath, squeezing Sophie's hand tighter. We've both made mistakes. I think we can both admit that. Sophie nodded, her throat tight as the weight of the last few months finally started to lift. I just want us to be okay, Olivia. I don't know how to fix everything, but I want to try. I don't want to lose you. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie saw a glimmer of hope in Olivia's eyes, a glimmer that reminded her of all the good times they had shared, of the bond they had once had. Olivia didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled softly, a quiet, bittersweet smile that told Sophie that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back to each other. I don't want to lose you either, Olivia said softly. But it's going to take time. We can't just go back to the way things were. It's going to take work. But I think we can do it, if we're both willing to try. Sophie felt a weight lift from her shoulders as she finally allowed herself to believe that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new. Something they could rebuild together. As they sat there, talking softly, the world outside seemed to fade away. For the first time in months, Sophie didn't feel so alone. She didn't feel like she had to carry the burden of everything on her own. The journey ahead would be hard, it would be complicated, but at least they were on it together. And that, Sophie thought, was enough for now. The weeks that followed the meeting at the cafe felt like a blur of gradual progress. Sophie and Olivia didn't rush things. There was no magical reconciliation where everything was perfect again. Instead, they took small, tentative steps toward rebuilding what had been broken. It was awkward at first, uncomfortable even, but every small moment of connection felt like a victory. Sophie still remembered the first time they had talked on the phone after that day. It wasn't a deep conversation, nothing profound was said, but it was a start. They discussed trivial things, work, the weather, the latest movie they wanted to see. It felt almost normal again, but there was still an undercurrent of something unspoken between them. Both of them knew that they weren't out of the woods yet. But the more they talked, the more Sophie felt a sense of healing beginning to take root in her. She wasn't sure if Olivia could forgive her completely, or if she would ever be able to forgive herself for everything that had happened, but there was something undeniable about the small gestures of understanding they were beginning to share. One night, Sophie received a message from Olivia, an invitation to dinner at her place. Sophie hesitated for a moment, the old anxieties creeping in. Was she ready for this? Was she ready to step back into Olivia's life, knowing that things would never be the same? But then she remembered the smile Olivia had given her in the cafe. She remembered the quiet but sincere promise that they would try. And so, she agreed. When Sophie arrived at Olivia's apartment, she was surprised to find that everything was unchanged. It was the same cozy, eclectic space Olivia had always had. The smell of pasta and garlic filled the air, and the sound of soft music played in the background, just like old times. Olivia greeted her with a warm hug, and for a moment, it felt like nothing had ever happened between them. The warmth of Olivia's embrace, the familiarity of her scent, it was comforting, like coming home after a long, difficult journey. They sat down at the small dining table, their food laid out in front of them. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple homemade meal, but the gesture felt monumental. It felt like a sign of trust, of trying to move forward. "I've missed this," Olivia said softly, taking a sip of wine. Her voice was steady, but Sophie could hear the vulnerability beneath the surface. Sophie nodded, her heart aching. "Me too. I didn't realize how much until I was sitting here with you." They ate in silence for a while, not needing to fill the space with words. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was comfortable, the kind of comfortable that comes when two people have weathered a storm together and are learning to find their way back to each other. But as the meal came to an end, the weight of the past couldn't be ignored forever. Olivia looked up at Sophie, her expression serious, but gentle. "I know we're trying, but there's something I need to say," Olivia said, her voice trembling just slightly. "You hurt me, Sophie. You really did. I'm not going to pretend like everything's okay right away. But I don't want to carry this anger anymore. I don't want to hold on to it." Sophie's heart clenched at the words. She had expected this conversation, had been bracing herself for it, but it didn't make hearing it any easier. She had been the one to cause the pain, and she had to face it. "I know," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I hurt you. I didn't mean to, but I did. And I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry." Olivia's eyes softened. "I know. And I'm sorry too. I've been holding on to things that I shouldn't have. I've been angry at you for things that weren't even your fault." The words were like a balm to Sophie's soul, soothing the rawness that had been there for so long. They were finally acknowledging the pain, not sweeping it under the rug, but allowing themselves to heal from it. "You've been hurt too," Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't see it before. I thought I was the only one suffering. But now, I see how much I've put you through. And I want to make it right. I want us to move forward together." Olivia nodded slowly. "I want that too. But I need time. I need to know that you're not just sorry because you're afraid of losing me. I need to know that you really understand why this hurts so much." Sophie paused, letting the weight of Olivia's words sink in. She had always been afraid of losing Olivia, of losing the one person who had been there for her through thick and thin. But now she understood that it wasn't just about not wanting to be alone. It was about respecting Olivia's pain and giving her the space to heal, too. "I understand," Sophie said, her voice firm now, confident. "I'm here for you, Olivia. I'm here for the long haul. I want to earn your trust back. I know it's not going to happen overnight, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The room was silent for a moment as Olivia considered her words. Then, finally, she smiled, a small, hesitant smile, but a smile nonetheless. "Okay," she said softly. "Let's take this one step at a time." Sophie's chest tightened, relief flooding through her. It wasn't a perfect fix. It wasn't a magic solution that made everything okay. But it was progress. It was a promise that they were both willing to try. The weeks after that dinner passed in a slow, steady march of small victories. Sophie continued to make amends, to be there for Olivia in the ways that she had failed before. She learned to listen, to offer support, to give Olivia the space she needed to heal. It was challenging. Sometimes it felt like they were taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but with every conversation, every moment of connection, they began to rebuild. And slowly, the trust that had been shattered began to heal. It wasn't the same as it had been before. It would never be the same. But it was something new, something stronger, built on honesty, vulnerability, and the hard work of facing their past mistakes. One evening, months later, as they sat on the same couch they used to share, laughing over a silly movie, Sophie realized something. She had finally forgiven herself. She had stopped holding onto the guilt, the shame, the weight of what she had done. She had let go of the fear of losing Olivia, and in doing so, had found the courage to truly show up for her. Olivia glanced over at Sophie, smiling. "I never thought we'd get here, you know?" Sophie smiled back, her heart light. "Me neither. But we did." And that, in the end, was enough. The next few months were quieter than either Sophie or Olivia had expected, but not in a bad way. After so much chaos and heartache, the stillness was a welcome change. Sophie felt like she had learned a new rhythm with Olivia, one that wasn't fueled by the frantic need to fix everything but by the slow, steady work of healing. Still, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper between them, something they hadn't yet addressed. It was a shadow that lingered in the corners of their friendship, one that neither of them wanted to acknowledge fully. They had talked about the past, they had worked through the anger and hurt, but there were still pieces of their relationship left unspoken. Sophie had her own struggles, too. She had started seeing a therapist, trying to unpack the self-doubt and insecurity that had always been her constant companions. She realized how much of her life had been driven by the fear of rejection, the fear of being abandoned by those she loved. She had carried that fear into her relationship with Olivia, and it had poisoned everything. But therapy was helping. Slowly, she was learning how to let go of that fear, how to trust that people wouldn't always leave, that her worth wasn't dependent on someone else's approval. Still, no matter how much work Sophie did on herself, there were times when she felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. Olivia was healing, but Sophie knew the scars of their falling out would take longer to fade. And what if Olivia couldn't fully forgive her? What if she still held on to the pain, even if she didn't say it? What if they weren't really on the same page after all? It wasn't until one late afternoon that Sophie began to realize the true depth of her insecurities. She had been invited to a dinner party at Olivia's house, a small gathering of close friends. As soon as Sophie walked through the door, she felt an almost palpable tension in the air, one that wasn't immediately apparent to anyone else, but to her, it was undeniable. Olivia greeted her with a warm hug, her usual brightness lighting up the room, but there was something different in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation that Sophie couldn't ignore. The dinner was lovely, everyone was laughing and chatting, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't until after dessert, when most of the guests had started to trickle out, that Sophie found herself alone with Olivia in the kitchen. "Everything okay?" Sophie asked, trying to keep her voice casual, but she could hear the edge of worry in her tone. "You've seemed a little distant tonight." Olivia paused, looking down at the dishes she was cleaning, then wiped her hands on a towel before meeting Sophie's gaze. "I don't know," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. I've been carrying around some stuff, and I'm not sure how to deal with it." Sophie's heart sank. "What stuff?" Olivia sighed, leaning against the counter, clearly struggling with how to put her thoughts into words. I think I've been putting too much pressure on you. And on us. I've been expecting things to go back to normal right away, but that's not fair to you. I know you've been trying really hard, but I haven't been the best friend I could be either." Sophie's stomach twisted with anxiety. She had no idea what Olivia was about to say, but the vulnerability in her voice made Sophie feel like she was on the edge of something huge. "Olivia, you've been amazing. You've been patient, and you've let me into your life again. I can't thank you enough for that. But If something's bothering you, please just tell me. Olivia hesitated, then spoke in a tone that was barely above a whisper. I've been scared. Scared that we're not really okay. Scared that things have changed between us and that maybe we'll never get back to what we were. And I didn't want to admit it, but I think I've been holding you to an impossible standard. Like, I expect you to fix everything, and that's not fair. Sophie stood still, feeling the weight of Olivia's words pressing against her chest. It was so raw, so real, and it hit Sophie harder than she had anticipated. She had been so focused on her own guilt, so consumed by her own need for forgiveness, that she hadn't even considered how much Olivia had been carrying. How much she had been expecting from Sophie, too. I'm sorry, Liv, Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. I never meant to make you feel like I was just trying to fix everything. I just wanted to make things right. But I see now that I can't do it all on my own. I can't be the one to fix everything. Olivia's eyes softened, her shoulders relaxing a little as if Sophie's words had lifted some of the weight from her own heart. I don't expect you to fix everything, Sophie. I think I've just been holding on to too many expectations. I've been afraid to let go, afraid that if I do, we'll lose everything. But the truth is, we're both learning. We're both growing, and it's going to take time. Sophie nodded, feeling a sense of clarity that she hadn't expected. You're right. It's not just about fixing things. It's about letting go of the idea that we can somehow undo the past. We can't erase the hurt, but we can keep moving forward. Olivia smiled faintly. I think we're getting there. Slowly, the conversation had shifted something inside Sophie. She hadn't realized how much she had been carrying, how many things she still hadn't processed or acknowledged. She had been so focused on making up for her mistakes, on proving herself worthy of Olivia's forgiveness, that she hadn't stopped to think about what she needed from Olivia in return. What she needed from herself. As the night wore on and they cleaned up the kitchen together, Sophie realized that the road to healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't a series of neat, easy steps. It was messy, filled with setbacks and missteps. But the fact that they were still standing there, side by side, felt like a victory in itself. When Sophie left that night, it wasn't with the same sense of uncertainty she had felt in the past. She wasn't sure exactly how everything would turn out, or how long it would take for them to fully heal. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a quiet sense of peace. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but at least she wasn't walking it alone. And that, for now, was enough. As the months continued to pass, Sophie and Olivia settled into a fragile, but functional, routine. There were still bumps in the road, moments where they would trip over old wounds or slip into old patterns of behavior. But with every setback, they became a little more aware of their needs and expectations. They learned to give each other the space to grow, while still holding on to the parts of their friendship that mattered most. However, as much as Sophie had thought they were healing, something still felt unresolved. It was as though there was an invisible barrier between them, something unspoken that neither was willing to confront. Sophie often caught herself wondering if Olivia was holding back, if there were things Olivia wasn't sharing, things she wasn't ready to say aloud. It wasn't until an unexpected event shook their world that Sophie realized just how far the ripples of their past could still reach. One afternoon, Sophie's phone buzzed with a notification. A message from her mom. Call me when you get a chance. Sophie's stomach twisted. Her mom had always been the kind of person who would text just to chat, not to give cryptic warnings. Something was off. A sense of foreboding settled in her chest as she dialed her mom's number, the anxiety growing with each passing second. Hey, Mom. What's going on? Sweetheart, we need to talk, her mother said, her voice tight and stressed. It's your dad. Sophie felt her blood run cold. Her dad? The one person who, despite everything, had always been a rock in her life? What could possibly be wrong? What happened? Sophie managed to ask, her voice barely a whisper. He had a heart attack, Sophie, her mother said, her voice trembling. It's bad. We're at the hospital now, but the doctors are saying it doesn't look good. You should come. You need to come. Sophie's world tilted, spinning around her. It felt like she was being pulled into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. She barely registered the rest of the conversation, the words a blur. All she could think about was the shock of it all, how her dad, the man who had always been so invincible, was now lying in a hospital bed, his life hanging by a thread. She hung up the phone without another word, her mind racing. There was only one thing she could do now, get to her family. But the one thing Sophie hadn't expected was the looming decision she would have to face, what to do about Olivia. Olivia had always been there for her, through thick and thin. She had been her rock during the darkest times, offering support when Sophie had needed it the most. But this was different. This was her family. This was the man who had raised her. Sophie was caught in a storm of emotions, grief, fear, guilt, and confusion. She knew she couldn't leave Olivia behind, but what if Olivia needed space? What if she wanted to distance herself from the situation, from Sophie's family? Their bond had been tested already, and now Sophie wondered whether this crisis would push them even further apart. It didn't take long for Sophie to make up her mind. She called Olivia, her hands shaking as she held the phone. Liv, I need to go to the hospital. It's my dad. He's really sick, Sophie said, her voice cracking. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should ask you to come, or if it's too much. But I need someone. I need you. Olivia was silent for a beat. Then, her voice came through, steady and reassuring, though Sophie could hear the concern in her tone. Of course, Sophie. I'll be there. I'm not going anywhere. It was exactly what Sophie needed to hear. She felt a sense of relief flood over her. Olivia wasn't going to turn her back on her, not in this moment. Sophie wasn't alone in this. She had someone who would stand by her, no matter what. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Sophie's thoughts were a whirlwind, her heart heavy with worry for her dad. She thought about her mom, her siblings, and the rest of her family, wondering how they were holding up. The last time she'd seen her father, they had been talking about the possibility of retirement, about what life would look like when he was no longer working. Now, all of that seemed so far away, like a distant dream that would never come true. When they arrived at the hospital, Olivia was there by her side, offering quiet comfort with every step. They moved through the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways together, the tension hanging thick in the air. Sophie's mind was racing, trying to prepare herself for whatever she might find when she reached her dad's room. The door to the ICU was closed. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she pushed it open, her eyes immediately locking onto the figure lying in the bed. Her father, once so full of life, now looked frail and fragile, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed in the quiet room. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as she took a few hesitant steps forward, her eyes filling with tears. "Mom," she asked, her voice shaking. Her mother was sitting by the bed, her hand resting gently on Sophie's dad's. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Sophie, you made it. He's been asking for you." Sophie moved to her father's side, her hand trembling as she took his. "Dad? Dad, it's me," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. His eyes fluttered open, and he gave her a faint, tired smile. "Sophie, sweetheart." He murmured weakly, "I knew you'd come." Sophie tried to hold back her tears, but they came anyway. She squeezed his hand, holding on to him like he might slip away any second. Her mind was racing, trying to reconcile this fragile version of her dad with the man she had always known to be strong and invulnerable. Olivia stepped back, giving Sophie and her family the space they needed, but her presence was a silent, steady comfort. She hadn't been part of Sophie's family before this, but in that moment, it didn't matter. Olivia was there for her, and that meant the world. The hours that followed were a blur of emotions. Sophie's father was stable for now, but the doctors didn't offer much hope. They explained that there had been too much damage, that his heart might not be strong enough to recover. As Sophie sat by her dad's side, holding his hand and talking to him through the long night, she realized something. She had spent so much time trying to fix things with Olivia, trying to make up for the past, that she had never really confronted the fear of losing her own family. And now, in the face of a crisis she wasn't ready for, Sophie had to dig deep. It was no longer just about the rifts in her friendships or the mistakes she had made. It was about learning to cope with the things beyond her control, the things that couldn't be fixed by apologizing or trying harder. Some things were out of her hands, and she would need to learn to face them head-on. As she sat there, knowing that the future was uncertain, Sophie realized that life, much like love and friendship, wasn't perfect. It was fragile, and it was in the moments of uncertainty that she would find her true strength. Sophie couldn't remember how long she'd sat there next to her father, the quiet hum of the machines and the occasional sound of footsteps in the hallway the only things keeping her tethered to the present. She had lost track of time. The day had bled into night, and then into morning again. Each hour felt like a lifetime, but still, she refused to leave. Even when Olivia offered to take her home, Sophie couldn't bring herself to step away from her father's side. Her mom hadn't left either, and now, as the light from the morning sun began to filter in through the blinds, the hospital room was filled with a quiet sense of waiting. Sophie was grateful for Olivia's presence, even if she didn't say much. She wasn't alone in this, and in a way, that felt like the only thing keeping her from completely falling apart. After several tense hours, the doctors came in to talk to them. The sterile white coats, their faces solemn but professional, only made the weight of the situation sink further into Sophie's bones. Her father wasn't improving. The machines were doing most of the work now. He was stable for the moment, but the prognosis was grim. Sophie's mother had been silent for most of the conversation, her face pale as the doctors explained the situation in medical terms Sophie could barely understand. It was only when they left that her mother spoke. "He's still hanging on," her mom said quietly, her voice strained, but steady. "But I don't know for how much longer." Sophie sat on the edge of the chair, gripping her father's hand tightly. A part of her refused to believe it, refused to accept that this might be the end. Her dad wasn't just some man lying in a hospital bed. He was the person who had shaped her life, who had been there through every high and low, guiding her with his strength and steady love. It was hard to accept that even the strongest people could be taken from us. Sophie's throat tightened, but she refused to cry. Not yet. Not until she knew for sure that it was over. As the days dragged on, Sophie became more and more entrenched in the waiting game. It wasn't just her father's health she was concerned about now. It was the unbearable tension in the air, the unspoken grief and fear that hung around her family, threatening to break them. She could feel her mother's pain every time she looked at her. Her mother, usually the rock of their family, was unraveling before Sophie's eyes. Sophie had always prided herself on being the one who could handle tough situations, the one who kept it together when everyone else was falling apart. But in the face of losing her dad, Sophie found herself doubting everything she thought she knew about herself. She was no longer the girl who could control everything, who could fix broken relationships or salvage damaged friendships. No, this was different. This was beyond her. Through it all, Olivia remained by her side. Sophie had never been more grateful for her friend's calm, steady presence. Olivia had a way of soothing Sophie's frazzled nerves without trying to fix anything, without offering empty words of comfort. She was just there, a constant source of support that Sophie desperately needed in this storm. It was during one of these quiet moments, while Sophie sat alone in her father's room, that she realized something. She wasn't just worried about losing her dad. She wasn't just terrified of the thought of life without him. She was terrified of losing herself. Through all the years of focusing on what others needed, Sophie had never really stopped to ask herself what she needed. She had put herself last for so long, always trying to be the strong one, the dependable one, the one who never broke. But now, as she faced the possibility of losing her father, she had to confront the fact that she couldn't keep carrying everyone else's burdens without allowing herself the space to grieve, to feel, to be vulnerable. She was tired of being the one who held it all together. She was tired of pretending to be okay when everything felt so broken. And she knew deep down that her healing wouldn't begin until she allowed herself to be honest about the things that hurt. The pain of losing her father would be unbearable. She knew that. But Sophie understood now that the weight of that pain wasn't something she had to carry alone. She wasn't the only one who loved her father. She wasn't the only one who needed to grieve. And she wasn't the only one who could heal. A few days later, when the doctor came in again, Sophie's mom made the decision they had all been dreading. They couldn't prolong it any longer. Her father's body had fought as long as it could, but there was nothing more they could do. It was time to say goodbye. Sophie had never felt more alone in her life as she stood there, watching her father take his final breaths. The world outside the hospital seemed so distant, so far removed from the raw grief she was feeling. She had always imagined that the hardest part of life would be dealing with broken hearts, failed friendships, lost loves. But this was a different kind of pain. This was the kind of loss that shifted your entire perspective on life. This was the kind of grief that made you feel small, like you were nothing more than a fleeting moment in time, destined to fade away. And yet, as Sophie stood there beside her family, a strange sense of clarity washed over her. Her dad was gone, and there was no way to undo it. She couldn't change what had happened. But she could choose how to move forward. Sophie closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, allowed herself to cry. Her tears weren't just for her dad, though. They were for all the years she had spent holding herself back from feeling, truly feeling, everything that life had thrown her way. The fear, the guilt, the sadness, the grief. It had all been bottled up inside her, festering like a wound that couldn't heal. But now, Sophie knew. She knew that grief wasn't something to be afraid of. It wasn't something to hide or suppress. It was a part of life. And as much as it hurt, it also taught you how to love more deeply, how to cherish the moments you had, and how to heal. Olivia was there, as she always had been, holding Sophie close. She didn't say anything. There was no need for words. They both knew that sometimes, the only thing you could do in the face of such deep loss was simply to be there for each other. The pain of losing her father would never go away. It would always be there, a part of her. But Sophie realized that, just as the love she had for her father would never fade, she, too, could learn to move forward, to find hope again. And in the process, she would learn that true strength wasn't about holding it all together. It was about knowing when to lean on others and when to allow yourself to break. Because healing, Sophie realized, was never about perfection. It was about embracing the imperfections and finding the courage to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed too dark to navigate. The days following her father's death were a blur of funeral arrangements, family gatherings, and somber goodbyes. Sophie went through the motions, putting one foot in front of the other as the world continued to spin around her, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. It was the kind of loss that reshaped you, forced you to reconsider everything you thought you knew about yourself, about life. Sophie had been tested in ways she never imagined. She had faced the inevitable conclusion that nothing lasts forever, no matter how much you want to hold on. The funeral was a small, intimate affair. It was hard for Sophie to believe that the man she had admired her whole life was no longer there. She looked around at her family, her mother, her siblings, their friends, and felt a deep, hollow ache. How could they go on without him? How would she? And yet, through it all, Olivia remained at her side, unwavering. She didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless words of comfort. She simply showed up, offering quiet moments of support when Sophie needed them most. One evening, a week after the funeral, Sophie found herself sitting on the porch of her childhood home, staring out at the fading sun. The warm breeze tousled her hair, but the weight in her chest refused to lift. She had been sitting there for what felt like hours, lost in thought, when she heard footsteps behind her. Olivia came out, a mug of tea in her hands, and sat down beside her without saying a word. It was the kind of quiet that Sophie had come to cherish, the kind of silence that didn't demand anything. "I don't know how to do this," Sophie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to keep going without him. It doesn't feel real. How do I move on from this?" Olivia didn't answer immediately. She took a slow sip of her tea, staring out at the horizon. Sophie could see the look in her eyes, the deep understanding that came from someone who had faced their own share of loss. "You don't have to move on, Sophie," Olivia said gently. "You just have to move forward. Slowly, at your own pace." Sophie felt a lump rise in her throat. "I feel like I'm falling apart, Liv. I don't know who I am anymore." Olivia set her mug down and turned to face her. "You're not falling apart. You're grieving. You're mourning a part of your life that's gone. And that's okay. But don't forget who you are. Don't forget what you've overcome. Your dad was proud of you. And he wouldn't want you to lose yourself in all this pain. He'd want you to live, Sophie. To keep growing." Sophie wiped at her eyes, not caring that the tears were falling freely now. Olivia's words were a balm to her aching soul, soothing the jagged edges of her grief. She realized then that she hadn't just been mourning her father's death, she had been mourning the loss of the person she used to be. The girl who was so sure of everything. The girl who could handle any challenge, who could fix any broken relationship, who had always had a plan. But that girl was gone. And maybe, just maybe, that was okay. The weeks that followed were a slow process of rediscovery. Sophie had always believed that healing was a linear path, something you could plot on a map and follow step by step. But grief wasn't like that. It didn't adhere to a timetable. It came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes crashing down with all the force of a storm. But every time it came, Sophie learned to ride it, to embrace the pain without letting it consume her. She didn't get better overnight. There were days when she woke up with a heavy heart, days when she could barely find the energy to get out of bed. But there were also days when she could smile, when she could think of her father without the sting of sorrow. Days when she could begin to imagine a life without him, not in the sense of forgetting him, but in the sense of learning to live with the loss. And Olivia was there as she had always been. The friendship that had once been fragile, fractured by their own mistakes and misunderstandings, had found a new depth. They had both learned to be vulnerable with each other, to give and take in a way they hadn't before. Sophie realized that true friendship wasn't about perfection, it was about being there for each other, even when things were messy. As the months passed, Sophie returned to work, found new routines, and began to rebuild her life. She found herself having moments of joy again, moments where she laughed, moments where she felt hopeful. She discovered a new sense of independence, one that was born out of necessity, but also out of strength. The girl who had always been defined by her relationships with others was beginning to find out who she was on her own. One evening, Sophie stood in front of her father's grave, the sun setting behind her, casting long shadows across the quiet cemetery. She had come to visit him one last time, to say goodbye in the way she had always imagined, with peace. "Dad," she whispered, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I miss you. I don't think I'll ever stop missing you. But I'm okay. I'm finding my way. I'm learning how to keep going. I hope you're proud of me." As she spoke, Sophie felt something shift inside her. A lightness, a clarity. Her father was gone, but he would always be a part of her. And maybe that was the key to moving forward. not letting the pain of loss overshadow the lessons, the love, the strength that had come before it. Sophie turned away from the grave, feeling a new sense of resolution. She wasn't the same person she had been. But maybe that was a good thing. She was still learning who she was, still finding the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. And in that moment, Sophie realized that life wasn't about never falling apart. It was about learning how to rebuild when everything felt broken. It was about giving yourself permission to heal, to move forward, and to keep going, even when the world seemed like it might crumble. She didn't need to be perfect. She didn't need to have all the answers. All she needed to do was keep moving, step by step, toward the future that was waiting for her. The road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt ready to face it. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?